All right, let's get started. So welcome everybody to another episode of RATV. This is going to be the last of the year for us, and then we'll switch to doing more polished, higher production value podcasts for people to download. So get your Q&A in this time. We'll see what we can do. I'm Peter Kolchinsky. I'm one of the portfolio managers here at RA Capital. And before we begin, I just want to remind everybody that none of what you hear is intended to be investment advice. We're a regulated entity, and biotech is all stocks is risky. So with that, we're going to do a two-parter this time. The first part is going to be some discussion of the latest COVID news, developments in the drug space. Maybe touch on one of these variants that I guess Twitter occasionally touches on. Who are we kidding? Omicron is like the only thing you seem to read about. So we'll talk about that. And then we're going to dive into a discussion with some of our colleagues who work with our venture team as venture partners and entrepreneurs in residence on new company formation to talk about what it's like being a venture partner and entrepreneur in residence. So let's get into COVID first. Peter, Katie, you guys have spent some time getting up to speed on the latest developments since our last discussion. There's something to talk about on the oral antiviral front. I think we'll talk about those drugs in the context of monoclonal antibodies, and then we'll touch on Omicron. What can you tell us? What's new and exciting in the oral antiviral space?
Yeah, no, definitely, and excited to talk about this because there's been a lot of developments over the past few weeks and months, and so it'll be interesting to kind of chat about that. So, I guess the first big development we got was in October, early October, when Merck reported, initial data from a large phase 3 study of their oral polymerase inhibitor called molnupiravir. And the data came in at 50% reduction in hospitalization and death. And it was really exciting at the time because this was kind of the first big phase 3 of an oral direct acting antiviral. And while 50% is a little bit lower than a lot of the antibodies had shown, it was still really exciting because it was the first oral.
To be clear, they enrolled patients that basically show up with a positive COVID test and symptoms probably that might have prompted them to get the COVID test, and they had to have a risk factor for their COVID positivity flipping into something serious that might actually merit hospitalization or put them at risk of death. So some of those risk factors would have been what, like obesity, diabetes, what else?
COPD, hypertension, even age.
Just age alone?
Exactly.
That's
I think
right.
like 55, 60, something like that. And yeah, so basically, as you said,
and vaccinated or unvaccinated, previously recovered from COVID or not. It didn't really matter whether, they had pre-existing immunity, right? Like if you show up with symptoms and you're at higher risk, you were enrolled into the study. Is that correct?
So the molnupiravir trial actually just excluded vaccinated patients. So it was all unvaccinated, but I guess it's plausible that a patient who had prior COVID and had a reinfection could be enrolled.
Okay, because they did have some seropositive patients. So these would have been patients who had recovered from a prior COVID case.
Or had, seroconverted in the current infection.
Fair enough. That makes sense
it's
too.
kind of like hard to tease out, the reason for seropositivity. But, anyway, this 50% figure was super exciting. But what was disappointing was last week, Merck gave us the full phase 3 data. So previously we had an interim analysis and then they gave us the full analysis, and the data actually got a lot worse. From the 50% figure, it went all the way down to 30%, which is, still respectable, still active, but not the 50% or the 85% that everyone was hoping for.
And just recently, the FDA advisory committee still said, yeah, but we recommend it because 30% is nothing to sneeze at.
Yeah, and I think it was a pretty, it wasn't a unanimous vote as a lot of the adcoms go, but I think it was 13-10 in favor. But
why would anybody be against that? You get 30% risk reduction. Why say no?
Yeah, I think it came down to like the weirdness of the second half of the data, because if you looked at the patients who came in between the interim analysis and the final analysis, it looked like, you know, molnupiravir was actually trending worse than placebo, which was bizarre. And I don't think, you know, Merck had a good explanation for that. So you know, there is a little bit of weirdness in the data. And, you know,
but we're talking about initially the drug, like in the first set of patients, the drug had a 50% risk reduction, but in the second set of patients, it was like 0 or worse. So when you blend it and you call it a 30% risk reduction, that, you know, makes it sound like, oh yeah, it really works. But if you look at it as two different groups of patients and you wonder, like, how did the drug manage to like not work at all? Or could it really be making things worse in the second set? Sounded like that planted some doubts in the minds of some of the advisory committee members. What was the rebuttal? You know, why shouldn't we look at that second set of patients and say, hey, look, this drug could be causing harm?
Yeah, I think, you know, Merck's rebuttal was like the based on the statistical analysis plan, like the primary analysis was the interim analysis, and so the final analysis should be like supportive. But based on, you know, the way statistics are and the way they have to be pre-specified, I think it was all based on kind of the interim analysis.
So the drug wasn't bad enough in the second part of the trial to overturn, you know, the initial primary analysis, even though it would seem to be inexplicable and worrisome. But I mean, this drug would have had to like kill 20% more patients in order to negate the first half.
Yeah,
I don't know. You're sort of like leaning on the statistics too much. Might there have been some other basis for saying that the second set of patients were confounded? You shouldn't view it as dispositive.
Yeah, I don't know, like if there was a good explanation, but the problem wasn't just that. I think like the efficacy was a little bit disappointing. I think, you know, there was a lot of discussion also about like safety. You know, immunogenicity or genotoxicity, given kind of the mechanism of action. You know, we haven't seen issues like in the clinic with the molecule, based on, you know, the few hundred patients that have been treated. And it is only a short 5-day course. And, you know, they did extensive in vivo models preclinically and didn't see anything, but still, you know, based on the in vitro studies, it looked like there may be some immunogenicity, and so it's kind of hard to prove that it truly is safe unless you treat like thousands of patients. So
the Merck drug is not going to be the only one, you know, out there anyway, right? Like, tell us about the Pfizer drug quickly. That one was much more clearly positive.
Exactly. That I think that one's kind of more exciting, and that one's probably going to get authorized soon anyway. So, you know, molnupiravir could become obsolete or near obsolete quickly. So Paxlovid is Pfizer's drug, and Pfizer's drug is different than molnupiravir because Paxlovid is a protease inhibitor, and so it's going after a different kind of enzyme that the virus has.
How did Pfizer develop it so quickly? What was this protease inhibitor before they applied it to COVID, or did they magically come up with it just for COVID?
I think they were working on a protease inhibitor for a previous SARS outbreak in the early 2000s, and then they shelved it because of you know, it went away, and so I guess they were able to like quickly revive it, but it has been extremely impressive, you know, how fast they moved, and if you look at kind of how long it took for them to run the phase 3 study to get the interim data, and you compare that to how long it took Merck, like they're clearly on different timelines, and so it was pretty impressive how fast they enrolled the study. But what was most impressive about it was the efficacy. So in the interim analysis, there was an 85% reduction in hospitalization or death, you know, which is a lot better than molnupiravir's interim 50% and a lot better than.
Did they too exclude, by the way, vaccinated patients, or do they include them?
Yes, they excluded vaccinated patients.
Does
So
this mean that vaccinated people who show up symptomatic with COVID and have a risk factor are not going to be able to get these drugs to reduce their probability of being hospitalized or dying?
Yeah, it'll come down to what the FDA kind of decides in terms of like how broadly to authorize the label. Because these trials I think were designed for success in terms of like maximizing POS, and so it'll kind of take a leap of faith to authorize in vaccinated patients, even though if mechanistically a protease inhibitor is working in an unvaccinated patient, like it should still be working.
There's still people being hospitalized despite having been vaccinated.
Exactly.
Maybe they didn't get a good enough immune response. Maybe their immunity has waned, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe you get a new variant that can circumvent their immunity. I think it would be absolutely terrible and insane. I guess we're recording this, so I'm on the record. If in the end, the FDA and the CDC played it super cautious and ended up recommending a drug with an 85% risk reduction, only for unvaccinated people. I mean, it's the kind of thing that could have the unintended consequence of having people say, I'd be better off not getting vaccinated, so that this drug is there for me in case I get infected, right? Instead of getting a vaccination and then whenever some weird variant pops up that gets around it, that's it. I'm disqualified from getting this amazing drug. So my guess is that it's probably going to get approved. At least if the FDA and CDC look one chess move ahead, it'll get approved for everybody with a risk factor. Now, if you don't have a risk factor at the moment, all the data suggests that these drugs don't work. Do we really think they don't work, or is it just that the rate at which low risk people end up needing to be hospitalized or dying is so low that we don't have the statistics to demonstrate benefit?
Yeah, we really haven't seen that much data from many trials, because most of them, as I said, have been designed to succeed, and that comes with higher event rates, which comes from high risk patients. But I think there have been, there was a subgroup of patients from a antibody study that enrolled low risk patients where they were still able to show a benefit, but of course the delta benefit was narrower than in high-risk patients. And so again, this goes back to the idea of like vaccinated versus unvaccinated. Like if a drug is working mechanistically in vaccinated patients, you would expect it to work in unvaccinated patients, and kind of same thing for like high risk, low risk. The incremental benefit you get probably will be less since they're at lower risk, but
I can see once these drugs are priced that someone's going to make an argument and say the number needed to treat, the number of patients you'd have to treat, and therefore the total amount of money you'd have to spend on a group of high-risk patients to save someone's life or to avert, hospitalizations or whatever, is maybe reasonable. But low-risk people are at such low risk of their COVID positivity turning into a hospitalization or death that you'd have to spend too much money to save a life, right? Or to get a benefit. And then the question would be, but might it shorten their disease? Might it keep them from being as infectious and get them to be non-infectious sooner? But those studies have yet to be done, right? And so it'll be interesting to see whether amidst this pseudo-pandemic state, if regulators and payers basically are lenient and say, all right, let's get it out there and we'll study what the benefits might be, even in low-risk people, rather than be draconian and try to save money and limit this only to the high risk. We should mention there was another company, Atea, that was partnered with Roche on a polymerase inhibitor. They were developing the drug for hepatitis C and pivoted quickly to developing it for COVID. And there, Roche, after really courting Atea and saying we can do a great job in helping you develop this drug, the trial Roche wanted to do involved high risk and low risk. They wanted to rush to enroll as many patients as they could. And that trial ended up failing. And one of the reasons that we think maybe it failed was that low risk patients really would have diluted the effect, right? And so after that study failed, Roche parted ways with Atea leaving the company now to deal with this, failed trial result, and try to figure out how do you rescue that drug, if at all. But when we look at this very small chessboard and we think about what happened with hepatitis C, feels like odds are you're going to see mixing and matching of these drugs into cocktails, where maybe a drug like Merck's, which is a polymerase inhibitor, or a drug like Atea's, which is a polymerase inhibitor, might get paired with a protease inhibitor, like what Pfizer has, and there's a couple of other companies that have protease inhibitors. And in the end, what we're going to see are the results of these cocktails in patients. So I would expect 85%, if that holds up for one protease inhibitor, will do even better, and maybe it'll mean that in low risk people, it really helps to truncate, the duration of the symptomatic disease and shedding period. But we're not just developing these drugs for the current, problem. These drugs are going to be awesome should there ever be another coronavirus pandemic, because they work against the internal machinery of the virus, which is much less likely to change and is extremely well conserved, throughout all the coronaviruses, as opposed to the outer shell antibodies, vaccines. They work against the outer shell of the virus, and that outer shell tends to be much more mutable. So these antibodies that we've got that are injectable, they are possibly possibly going to be helpful in a future pandemic, but much less likely to be. When do you imagine, Peter, that somebody might get an antibody? And let's not talk about the IV infused antibodies, because that's really onerous. Subcutaneous or intramuscular, I should say, antibodies are coming, a shot. When would it make sense to get a shot instead of a simple prescription for several days worth of pills?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It just comes down to which one is going to be preferred, and the answer, I think, or the way we're thinking about it, is that it's going to depend on the treatment setting. So you can imagine in the acute infection setting, you start feeling under the weather, you got a test and you're positive, you're feeling symptoms. In that setting, it makes a lot of sense to use, an oral antiviral like Paxlovid, which is, has great efficacy, just because of its convenience.
And just a simple pill, right? Like your friend can pick up the prescription for you, or that could even be delivered by mail order or something like that really quickly, right? That makes sense. We also know that there's the post-exposure prophylaxis application of these. You've been exposed, and you don't want to find out whether you get sick. You just want to start taking the drug to nip it in the bud if possible. That's going to be something that we end up pursuing. Well, there too, time's of the essence. You may not want to go to a pharmacy to try to get a shot, if pharmacies even administer these shots. You may not want to, a hospital may not want to welcome you to get a shot. So pills would make sense. But then there's this final segment of pre-exposure prophylaxis, which is basically what vaccines do, right? They try to vaccinate you and protect you before you've ever been exposed. Similarly, if you're immunocompromised and vaccines don't work so well on you, could you imagine, just going on a course of these oral pills for what, your whole rest of your life?
Yeah, exactly. It would be, very, very high burden. And Merck's drug is, I think, twice a day. Paxlovid is 3 times a day. Maybe you wouldn't have to take it that frequently for PrEP, pre-exposure prophylaxis. But the advantage of the antibodies is that there are a few that are long acting, and so you could take a single dose, and it would protect you like a vaccine would in a healthy person for 6 to 12 months. And so you basically just take it and you forget about it. It's totally different.
And that's what some of these antibodies companies are working on doing, creating intramuscular formulations of their antibodies, which have to be extremely potent and engineered to be really long lasting. Adagio recently came out saying, we think, based on in vitro data, that our antibody works against the Omicron variant. That's what you want to hear. They have to show it, but you want an antibody that's going to work against a wide variety of these variants. And for people who don't respond well to a vaccine, or for some reason can't take a vaccine. I just heard about somebody who has chronic Lyme disease, and her doctors are telling her, don't get a vaccine. They'll rev up your immune system so much that you might get, some painful symptoms. I'm not sure whether that's true or not true, but there's somebody who has to avoid, vaccination right now based on what her doctors are saying. An antibody would be great for her, right? And so being protected for 6 to 12 months and getting those kinds of shots repeatedly, that's basically like a vaccine for the rest of us. Oral pills are going to be priced for what, 5 days, maybe 10, right? So putting somebody on an annual, prescription is going to be extremely expensive. It'll cost 30 times, 60 times more than treating episodically, right, as needed. I'm sure insurance is going to have something to say about that. And also these drugs are not, without their tox risks. Certainly the polymerase inhibitors, have a little bit more baggage there. So if they end up being developed in combination with the protease inhibitors, you're not going to want to give them all year. Protease inhibitors might be something that turn out to be safe enough, but it probably is not going to be Pfizer's 3 times a day. And theirs is a combo with a former HIV drug called ritonavir, which just sort of prevents the active COVID protease inhibitor from being degraded by your liver as quickly. Unfortunately, that favorable drug-drug interaction is also an unfavorable drug-drug interaction when it comes to all the other medications that these patients are on. You're going to want to treat high-risk patients, which means they're on all kinds of drugs for like heart failure and stroke prevention. Doctors are not going to want to have to juggle the complexity of adjusting all your other drugs just to figure out how to keep you on, that ritonavir-based Pfizer, COVID regimen. But if they had to treat you for 5 days, they could probably have patients discontinue some of those drugs for a few days in certain cases, right? Anyway, all of which to say, we've got a lot of tools coming down the pike, and they can't come soon enough because we got this damn Omicron variant to worry about. What do we know about Omicron? We'll just take 3 minutes to blast through our thoughts and then move on to the next segment.
Yeah, just some quick hits. So Omicron is the new variant of concern. This is what Delta is. So these are the ones that matter, the ones that we think might be able to evade immunity and cause more severe disease. Omicron has 50 mutations, 30 of which are in the spike protein, which this is the part of the virus that allows the virus to penetrate the host cells and cause infections. So this is why we think that there could be some ability to bypass existing immunity, although South Africa is where it came from, and there's pretty low vaccination rates there. Only around 25% of the population is vaccinated. So all we know so far from that is that it's bypassing natural immunity, not necessarily that it's bypassing the immunity from vaccination. There's a chance, because all the mutations, or not all of them, but a good portion of the mutations are in the spike protein, that the virus will be able to evade vaccine-mediated immunity. But this isn't an all or nothing thing. Delta, a previous variant of concern, was around 4-fold or so more resistant to vaccines, but the vaccines were still effective against Delta. So getting boosters should increase protection above what's needed to cause resistance to the new variant. So even with Omicron, if it's resistant, the original vaccine should help.
So it's interesting, right? As you look at how the companies like Moderna and Pfizer have responded, they are both going to be testing just boosting with the original vaccine to see whether you can, get to high enough levels where people are still protected against Omicron. But they're also preparing for the possibility that Omicron might be so much more resistant that it really makes sense to just switch the vaccine antigen to be the same as Omicron, right? And in that case, you would expect it to be much more effective against Omicron. And when you actually look at, what would people prefer, right? Well, consider that Moderna is talking about 100 microgram doses of their original vaccine, so a high dose of their vaccine, the original vaccine, in order to get you to boost you against Omicron, which is going to come with 2 consequences. One, that uses up more of their manufacturing capacity, right, than if they could use a lower dose, maybe 25 micrograms or 50 micrograms if it were Omicron specific, right? And at the same time, it's less tolerable. And so there's an advantage to, at some point, switching to just making your vaccine the same as the circulating strain, matching the strain, rather than trying to brute force your way with the original vaccine. You can use lower doses, which means you can stretch your manufacturing capacity and get those doses out to more people more quickly. And presumably it's going to be better tolerated. Someday we may have such a glut of capacity producing these things that it might be easier for companies to say, look, just take twice the dose, you'll be fine. It's probably not going to be with mRNA. It would have to be with protein-based vaccines where side effects tend not to be scale in proportion to the amount of protein antigen. Right. So too early to know exactly what Omicron is going to make us do with vaccines, but it's certainly nice to see companies pursuing all options in parallel. It sounds like they're saying that they could get Omicron-specific vaccines up and running and out the door probably by March, certainly April. And that's not surprising. It's just a matter of manufacturing a bunch of them, and the trials they would have to do are relatively short. Just dose a couple dozen patients and show that you can get titers. And that happens pretty quickly on the scale of weeks. So it's good to know that we're up and running. This is like a test for how quickly could we respond to a future pandemic. Right? It's actually pretty cool to see. All right. I think we covered the COVID stuff. Took a little bit longer than I had hoped, but why don't we quickly move into our second half? So I'm joined here now. Thank you very much, Peter and Katie. I'm joined here, Nadim and Ramin. There you go. Thank you very much. I'm joined by my colleagues, Nadim Shodi, Risa Stack, and Ramin Farzanafar. Nadim is an entrepreneur in residence, which is pretty much what it sounds like. He's an entrepreneur and he's hanging out with us. And Risa and Ramin are venture partners, which probably needs a little bit more explaining. I would say that for the most part, these two positions are pretty similar in terms of the day-to-day of what it's like to work together. We hang out together on Zoom. Occasionally, we're lucky enough to get together and have a beer. And we really could talk about anything that we're thinking of investing. There could be a mature company coming along that we're wondering whether to invest in. And that's not going to stop me from calling Ramin, even though Ramin and Risa and Nadim are mostly focused on what are some of the new opportunities out there where we could create a company around them, or maybe there's a very nascent company that is pitching itself to our venture team and it needs a lot of shaping and the team needs to be built out. And our venture partners and entrepreneurs in residence have real operating experience, unlike me. I have never run an actual biotech company. The closest I come to it is sitting on a board. And that makes me more like a movie critic than a director or producer, or gopher or whatever somebody, I'm not even a best boy. I think that's one of the titles in movies. You guys have been involved in running companies. And my question to you to start off this discussion, and maybe we'll just go in alphabetical order. So Nadim, starting with N. How does somebody like you with operating experience, maybe tell us a little bit about your operating experience, decide I want to become an entrepreneur in residence with an investment firm?
Sure. So thanks, Peter. I'm really happy to be here. And I'm actually in the office. So let me briefly talk to you about my operating experience. So I cut my teeth basically in operations in an unusual environment, actually an academic environment, where at NYU School of Medicine, where I was involved in writing a business plan and co-founding and then running their drug discovery accelerator program that basically acted sort of as an in-house virtual biotech / internal fund / business development engine, all around basically trying to take academic projects from NYU that are of interest to investors or drug companies, but are still too early. And that's where the group I ran came in. Basically, we took such projects, we did diligence, and then we built work plans, and through a network of CROs, consultants, and internal funding as well as external funding, we basically ran mini drug discovery projects in order to get the data package and associated IP much more attractive, much more de-risked, to convince investors and drug companies to go from saying this is interesting but too early to saying this is interesting, let's now build a company around it or in-license it and take it on. So in that process, we worked on dozens of projects. Roughly a third of them were successfully partnered. A third is still in play, and the rest basically, was resting in peace. The projects didn't meet their milestones. And for every successful project, there was 2 or 3 unsuccessful projects that led to a lot of incredibly valuable experiences around de-risking early stage therapeutics projects. And that's basically a big focus area of my activities as an EIR at RA.
It does sound like that's pretty much the job that you're doing here. Like, we're all working on tending to an entire garden of opportunities. Ramin, you're next in the alphabetical list. Tell us your journey here. What kind of operating did you do in biotech, and how did that prepare you, and sort of why did you choose to become a venture partner?
Sure, happy to do that. So just briefly, by way of background, I'm trained as a cardiologist. Spent a few years early on in academia, and my focus there was really on kind of biostatistics and study design, clinical trials. And then I made a move to industry, initially with Gilead, where I was running kind of large, typical cardiovascular outcomes trials with thousands of patients that are very sort of operationally and methodologically kind of intense. It's a good way to kind of learn the trade. And then following that, really decided I was more interested in pursuing smaller biotech, early stage. Spent some time in a company called Akebia in the renal space, and then the last 4 years prior to joining RA, I was the chief medical officer at Ra Pharmaceuticals. People always get confused because it's a capital R and a lowercase a, not a capital R and an uppercase a, but of course,
we actually had to report that as a conflict of interest when we invested. We were so drawn to the fact that the company's name was so similar to ours. We needed to demonstrate that didn't bias us.
Yes, I still get asked at least once a day that question. But of course, as you allude to, RA was one of the early supporters of Ra, and we took the company public and then ran a series of clinical trials in rare diseases, particularly in the neuromuscular space, which turned out to be quite successful, and the company was acquired in 2020. And I think really partly just by good fortune, round about the same time as that happened, you guys were raising your first venture fund, or had just raised it. And having been in a very intense kind of monomaniacal operating role for 4+ years, kind of focused on a single molecule, I was very much eager and excited to take an approach with a bit of a wider aperture on the lens, and look at multiple companies, see where I can help. Certainly just general diligence in areas, where I might have some expertise, but then also to kind of jump in several companies at once, with some kind of partial operating role, and then also helping out with some of the very early stage companies that we're incubating. So I think for me, the variety and the vision of where the venture fund was going to go, plus the opportunity to maybe provide some very early clinical trial guidance to companies that usually maybe wouldn't think about it, seemed like an interesting challenge and somewhere where I might be able to add some value. So that's how I came to join.
So just a quick follow-up, and then we'll ask Risa the same questions. But do you imagine, now that you've actually gotten a chance to do what interested you, which is get involved with a range of projects at the same time rather than be in on one, do you imagine at some point being a full-time operator with one company, working on a narrow scope of projects, or is this sort of tending to a portfolio of things? Like, is this your thing?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think you alluded to it a little bit at the beginning with the slight difference in titles with the EIR, which maybe is kind of a bit more declarative of that route, versus the venture partner, where at an equilibrium state, maybe you have, 4 or 5, half a dozen companies that you're contributing to at any one time, and they kind of spool in and spool off. I got to say right now, I'm really enjoying it. So I think, yeah, this, as of today, I think hopefully this is my thing. And yeah, I think we've been very fortunate, and I'm sure we'll get to this later in the discussion. There are a lot of new ideas. There's a lot of deal flow. So I think as long as there's that churn in a good way, as long as there's kind of the raw materials to work with, yeah, I think it's really exciting and a great way to see variety, but also dive in deep where it makes sense.
Yeah. Risa, tell us about your journey and how you came to RA and to being a venture partner.
Sure. I think I took a bit of a different path. I have a PhD in cellular immunology, but out of my PhD, I got something called the Kaufman Fellowship, which is a fellowship to learn how to be a venture capitalist. However, I ended up at a private equity firm. So I spent 7 years in private equity in New York and learned a lot about deals, but really realized what I missed was the science. I love the science, love being close to the science. So went to a venture firm. I went to Kleiner Perkins and I spent 10 years there. And that's where I discovered my love of building companies. I started a company called Veracyte, which is now a public company. It's a molecular diagnostic company. And I also, we were very hands-on when I was there at the time. And so we would do a lot of building. I helped build a company called Corthera, another company called Trias. Those are therapeutic companies. And then was also involved and did a lot of work in foundation medicine as well. So I really liked building, and then had the opportunity to go to GE. You said, why would you go to a big company? But it was the opportunity to have a new platform to build. And one of the things I think is always challenging is when you start a company, is it an idea or is it a company? And my thesis in going to GE was that there would be a lot of opportunities to start companies. I did two things there. I spun out companies based on technologies from GE and started a semiconductor company called Menlo Microsystems, which I'm still an advisor to. You say semiconductor company, but I just love technology, but I'm really a healthcare person at heart. That's why I'm back at RA. I also started companies based on ideas we got from our customers. So we started a company called Vinetti, which is software for the supply chain of cell therapy. And that happened because the CSOs of Kite and Juno, standalone companies at the time, came to GE and said, we have a problem, can you help us? And they sent it to my team. And so we started 8 companies. I would guess in today's nomenclature, I ran a venture studio at one point with all the companies that reported up into me. We had about 200 people and wanted to get back to like being hands-on and building. And RA is an amazing place to do that. As Ramin mentioned, wide aperture, you see a lot of amazing opportunities, a lot of different science. And I think for me, what differentiates RA is the connection and the fact that the firm started as public company investors. And I can really vision the life cycle of companies and having been at Kleiner Perkins and knowing like, yeah, get this company public. I mean, we knew what to do, but it was not as data-driven, as efficient as RA. And that what really differentiates the platform to me and why I was really excited to join the team.
Do you miss running companies? Do you imagine at some point getting in and being like, I'm all in, I'm going to steer the ship again?
Well, I'm halftime CEO of one of our stealth companies, which has been a blast. Really enjoy that. Maybe, it really I would say I have to fall in love. I mean, I do love seeing the wide variety of opportunities and like Ramin, I love the opportunity to help on, a number of different companies at once and really feel that I'm intellectually challenged by seeing multiple types of businesses, whether it be looking at cell therapy one day or small molecules another and connecting the dots. It's what I really enjoy. So,
yeah. I mean, one of the things I would say is we've learned to think of RA Capital as not ending at who are the full-time employees, but actually extending, our understanding of our firm to our portfolio companies. If we own 80% of a company, is it really different than RA? I mean, it's basically, us, right? If we own 50% of a company, it's like 50% us, right? You got to get down to a pretty small ownership stake before you start saying like, well, I'm just a shareholder of this other entity and it's not really of us. But even then, if it's one of our larger positions and we own, maybe 10% of the company, then the fate of that company is intertwined with our fate. So we've learned to think about how can we, make it more fluid, that our team, like if we can help our companies in any way whatsoever, like we'll just help. And so having people like you guys on our team that can step in as an interim executive as needed and just like get things done, sort of it makes that relationship between the companies and us, the investment firm, much more fluid, right? I'd love for you guys to talk about your days, your typical days, and just anybody jump in and discuss amongst yourselves how you tackle your jobs in your own unique ways. Like, how do you look for opportunities? Where do you find them? Who do you talk to? How much of your time is spent internally talking to RA people about ideas versus out there in the broader world looking for them?
I'm happy to start. So just to take each of those in turn, I think an average day would be a combination of several different kind of activity streams. I think one that's kind of always there in the background for all of us is some aspect of diligence. So typically, in a given week, there'll be 2 or 3 new companies. Mostly, I think, falling into the category that you mentioned of kind of nascent things from outside, but very early. So looking for a seed stage or maybe a Series A. And depending on the domain expertise required, one or more of us may be pulled in to that. Actually, I have one right after this call. And those will typically be, an initial airing of the pitch deck with the management team. And it may be 1 or 2 of us, and then a couple of the venture analysts and sometimes somebody from the investment side or from Tech Atlas. And then we'll have a debrief afterwards and decide if we want to go deeper. There may be other things where we're a little further along. We might be under confidentiality and be in a data room and have some calls about companies that are further along in diligence. And then for the companies that we're sort of attached to, in an interim role or in a partial operational role, then there may be some specific activities around that. So it could be team meetings, could be reviewing tox data, could be authoring or reviewing some FDA documents, again, depending on where the company is at. And then I think, at least for me, the final work stream that's a little more, comes and goes in waves is the soft skill element of kind of making contacts and putting people in touch with each other. So I think all of us from time to time hear about individuals, maybe in big pharma or from prior roles, who are now looking to move. And I think, we spend a good amount of time wondering if, some of the good people we've worked with in previous lives may be able to find new homes in one of the portfolio companies. And so that'll often involve a lot of introductions and sort of getting that process going in terms of, whether there might be a road to recruitment there.
So when ideas come through, do they just tend to come in to RA more generally and you're pulled in on it? Or do they come in through your network and you pull in members of RA, to help diligence?
Yeah, I think maybe I'll go first and then the others should weigh in. I think there's always a background rate that's coming in through just the RA kind of net. That's probably the majority. I think 2 or 3 really good ones have come through my daughter's school from the parents of my daughter's school. So I mean, sort of somewhat random, but in a place like Boston where there are so many people in the ecosystem, I think our personal networks can bring a few in. And then remarkably, on occasion, there'll be a cold approach, by email or by LinkedIn that, many of them are, maybe, not so good, but occasionally there's a diamond in the rough that just comes in cold. And, we've had a couple of those too, but I know Risa, Nadim.
Yeah, so I'd say in terms of where my deal flow comes, I'd say I'm, by the way, I'm sitting in the RA offices today, but I'm based in San Francisco, and having spent time on the investing side, I have a lot of deal flow that I would say comes from academia, comes from investors I've worked with in the past, management that I've invested in their companies. So, and I'd say the bulk of my things that come in is, occasionally scientific ideas, but a lot of things that are quote companies, but they're really an idea that needs a lot of work to be a company. So I tend to bring in a lot of different projects, and then make sure that the right folks at RA review them, and on occasion have considered taking either advisory or part-time operating roles to help get them going.
So would these things be coming to you anyway through your network, even if you were just a free agent?
I would say yes, to a certain level, but I would say that the RA brand attracts a lot more attention, in the sense that a lot of my network knows that I'm now affiliated with RA, and and knows of the power of the platform, and so I would say a lot of folks looking for capital that as an individual I wouldn't be able to offer, but
so it potentiates you, like there's this potential for you to like absorb from your network, and the affiliation helps bring it out. And then in terms of the triage bandwidth, how much do you lean on like the Tech Atlas folks or the venture folks to evaluate the deals to enrich the ones that are then worthy of your time? Or is it the other way around? Do you filter them, decide which ones are worthy of your time, and then recruit others to do a deeper dive?
Yeah, I try and do at least the high level filter. Like, is this even of interest to the group? Right? There's so much deal flow out there, but I think the amazing thing is that you have the Tech Atlas team. I brought in a neuro deal. A friend of mine, ex-banker, is involved, and science looked really cool. We have obviously great strength in Tech Atlas, but we had a number of EIRs and venture partners, and so set it around and got the right team on the phone to do due diligence. That one we didn't proceed, but it was definitely something we'll watch. So for me, I really like to leverage both the venture partner EIR network and the Tech Atlas folks, because I think we have a great ability in this firm to get to a quick no, which I think a lot of firms don't. And I do think that a lot of companies appreciate that. And from what I've seen, our no often comes with really good feedback. Like, not just, no, it's not for us. It's no, here's what we're looking for. Come back when you have this. And again, I've seen companies, even in my only year here, come back and say, well, we have that, right? So I think there's real value to pushing it into the network at RA pretty quickly, because people can be pretty efficient in their due diligence at RA. Yeah.
Nadeem, what's your experience been? How do you spend your day as the representative entrepreneur in residence? Is it a radically different day than we just heard about?
So it definitely has a lot of similarities with the experiences of Ramin and Risa, but my scope tends to be much more earlier stage, much more closer to the science, and I have and a lot of my time is on operations. In addition to looking deeply on much more earlier, much more raw science, whether based on external opportunities, mostly academics, or internal ideas that are informed by really cutting edge or maybe even bleeding edge science. So a lot of my time, so a portion of my time is actually also spent in an operations role for one of our portfolio companies, Clear Creek Bio, that's developing small molecule antivirals. But the majority of my time is spent mostly with our Raven incubator, looking at triaging with other members of RA, very early opportunities, thinking about de-risking experiments that could be done at CROs or sponsored research in academics or a mix thereof, as well as also, triaging very, very early stage startups that are basically academic projects with a twist, this in a nicer packaging, but still as very relatively early projects.
Yeah. So do you imagine that you're going to be able to, as these companies evolve, continue to work with them, from your current seat, or is the idea to help them until you can replace yourself at that company with somebody else? You know, and are you using the platform to sort of scope around and find the company? It's like, oh, that's the right moment. I'm going to jump in. I'm going to fill that full-time role.
Yeah. So to borrow what Risa said, it's all about whether you fall in love or not. So at this point, I really, really enjoy working on lots of different projects, not just because of the variety, I'm scientifically curious, but also as a consequence of working in the early stage. The earlier you go, the higher the risk that, you know, the project may not be validated enough to warrant pulling together a team, an investment, and build an actual company. So because my area is, you know, laser like focus on the early stage, it also comes with a higher risk profile, which also makes it more attractive to be working on a variety of projects. But this is also why I like that a portion of my time is spent with one dedicated portfolio company, because at least there it's the company's already built and moving along, and the other projects may or may not lead to, you know, to actual startups or succeed in those de-risking experiments. So I like the variety for now, but we'll wait and see.
Yeah, and one thing I would point out is, you know, RA Capital full-time formal employees, you know, can't actually get equity in any of the companies. The only way that we benefit, you know, from investing in companies is through the, you know, fees that we're able to charge on the profits, you know, from how well those companies do. And, you know, that helps to, you know, prevent conflicts of interest, right? So even as a director, when I get shares in any biotech company, public or private, those shares are put back into the fund for the benefit of all LPs. But to attract, you know, people with operating experience that could be going to a company and could be getting, you know, equity in those companies, we had to come up with a framework, which is not unique to us, other firms do this too, that would allow people to, you know, also have equity in those companies that they invest in their time into, right? And it draws them closer to those particular companies. And I'm curious, the fact that there are members of the team that don't have equity, that represent, you know, RA Capital's, you know, proper interest, you know, in the financial returns of those companies in the context of an entire portfolio, versus how attached one can be when they work really closely with the company and even have equity in it. Is there a downside and upside? Like, what have you discovered from, you know, having that kind of open dialogue with other members of the team that are, you know, 100%, you know, inside RA as employees?
Yeah, I actually think it's a very interesting framework, because if you think about sort of what has to happen to move forward, it's kind of three stars need to align all at the same time. At least that's been my experience, you know, with the companies where I'm formally committing a chunk of my time. And namely, that means, you know, RA as a firm's decided to make the investment. So, you know, all that diligence checks out and it's a good story. The venture partner themselves wants to make that commitment, which probably says something, you know, above and beyond that, and, you know, and is willing to make that commitment. And then also the company, you know, is part of that too, and they have to see a need and a utility in having that venture partner, you know, either join the board or join the board and take an interim role. And I think when all three of those stars align, that's obviously generally very favorable. Like, a lot of things have to be aligned for that to happen.
What's the sequence in which those align? Is it RA decides to invest? You know, are you free to say, look, whether you invest or not, I'd be game to help this company, you know, I can do it as a side project. Like, are these two, at least those two stars, are they two independent decisions?
I think they're independent decisions. I think when they're ultimately all going to be green lights, they tend to happen, you know, more or less simultaneously, and it's been smooth. But I think the converse scenarios can also occur. I could imagine a scenario. In fact, I think there maybe was one scenario where kind of made a lot of sense to me to do something, but, you know, I think the firm as a whole concluded that maybe it didn't, and that totally made sense. And so, we didn't move forward on that one. I could imagine another scenario where,
But
we might
but you
do
went with the company, Ramin?
Sorry?
But did you go with that company? Like, did you
No, I
get
didn't.
involved?
No.
Okay. So,
Yeah, and I don't think, not that we've sort of, discussed this to a great extent, but I'm not, particularly interested in going off reservation. There's so much to do within the ecosystem we have that I don't think that comes up very often. But I think the reverse could also happen, where you could take something over the line with diligence, and maybe at the last minute you say, the company's decided they just can't, doesn't make sense for you to be committing 2 days a week to this. They've got it covered, but RA wants to do the investment. It's a great story. And, we might bow out gracefully at that point and just be happy that we did a good job on diligence, and that frees up time for the next thing.
Yeah, I would agree with Ramin. It's pretty fluid. I brought in an opportunity, and they wanted me involved, and the company wanted me involved, and then they, for a lot of reasons, got this huge safe note, and we were doing our due diligence at RA, was working with the team on the due diligence, and end up really liking the deal. But then the company had got a huge safe note, and they're like, yeah, we don't actually need your money. And so it's like, well, it didn't quite align there. So I think, to Ramin's point, like, you've got to be flexible, because things sometimes don't look like they're lining up, and then they line up, or they kind of line up and then fall apart. And so you just have to be patient. It's just like any deal, I think. And it, as Ramin points out, there's just this extra component of, it's not only does RA like it, but is there a role, and does the company want our help? Because sometimes the companies, I think Ramin alluded to this, maybe think they want your help and they change your mind. So it's all in flux. So.
Well, I guess sometimes a company can say they want your help in order to endear themselves to you and be like, yeah, we really value you. But if you ever say, so you will carve out equity for this person, it's like, oh no, I thought that was just going to be free, right? And there have been occasions where a company said, look, we're prepared to sell you stock, you can invest in the company, we're not giving out equity to anybody else. And we really wanted one of our people involved, like a venture partner or EIR. And so we had to carve out, some equity from what we had purchased in order to create that alignment with the person. So there's a higher bar for that. But the hope is that you basically have these two independent processes, right? Where you, with your experience, say, I'm really drawn to this, which then gets our team, the investment team, interested, doing their independent assessment. It's like, oh, that was a good signal. This was worthy of deeper diligence. And then you come together and you make a stronger decision, or vice versa. You see that our investment team is really interested, and you take interest, and you spend some time with it, and you're like, you're right, there is something really good there. And so, it's meant to be synergistic. But I would imagine that there will come a time when we look back over 10 years and see the number of times that there was disagreement, and the opportunity to see, should we have trusted the instincts of our VPs and EIRs? The investment team didn't get it, but somebody with real operating experience did, or vice versa, where the VPs and EIRs are like, you know what, that's the last time I'm joining a company that doesn't have the investment team's buy-in. So it'll take a while for us to get that experience. Nadeem, maybe you can close us out by telling us what's the most fascinating puzzle you've tackled in the last couple of weeks.
You mean a puzzle at RA? Because actually at home, we actually build puzzles, me and the kids.
No. I mean, puzzle, something that our audience would be like, oh, wow, those are the kinds of problems they have to solve, to bring a drug to market.
Sure. So let me think. So, well, I'm not going to, definitely lots of puzzles. Whether we've completely solved them or not in the past couple of weeks is we're in the process of solving them. So, we look at opportunities. For example, one opportunity we're looking at for a novel drug discovery platform. And we were fascinated by the platform, but had to solve for what is the best application, as we call them in RA, the killer application for that platform. And after a lot of back and forth and around where to point that platform, we realized on one hand, there could be a couple of really, really nice directions but the platform isn't ready yet for our time and effort to jump in now to point it in that killer application. It needs a little bit more maturity. So that was just one example without giving too much away.
Yeah, so we even have a video on this exact concept on our venture website. We say to people who have a new capability, we say, of all the things you could be doing, what should you do? And you might imagine that somebody comes along and says, well, I have a novel kind of small molecule that can inhibit a class of enzymes. And you say, okay, so let's find out all the diseases that are linked to problems with this, enzyme family. Let's look at all of the standard of care drugs that are out there, all the other drugs in development against those, and find out, where is there a problem that will still persist, even if everybody else is successful in what they're doing. This problem will still persist and be valuable. And the clinical trials are doable in a reasonable period of time. And by the way, animal models exist that if we were to develop a small molecule and the animal model worked, you'd say it's predictive of human success. And like all those things have to work out for you to say, yeah, that's worth applying your capability to. And it's hard to get there from some sort of equation that just immediately lets you quantum tunnel to the result. Sometimes you have to have 5 people on the Tech Atlas team from all these different domains simply boil the ocean of diseases. And you go to everybody who covers certain maps and you just say, think of stuff. And through brute force, you end up winnowing, a list of dozens of, possible diseases. And you may come out with the conclusion, there's nothing, which is a shock. Because anytime you've got a new capability and you're like, surely there must be multiple things I can do. And sometimes investors can jump at that and they'll fund it and say, we'll figure out later what to do. But if you do that thought experiment ahead of time, you sometimes can save yourself a lot of heartache by discovering, gosh, there's just nothing good to do here with this. It's a tool waiting for, the killer app. Well, thank you very much for joining us for this RATV episode. And maybe we'll come back together to talk about some of the stuff that's not stealth, that would be worth getting into in more detail.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.